If the wind was in our sails, then we'd be all right. If the wind was in our sails, then we'd be all right.
Great to be here with all of you. As was mentioned, I am the president of the New Bedford Civil War Roundtable. This topic is still very much near and dear to my heart, and I find it a fascinating story when we talk about New Bedford's whaling industry, and specifically the effect of one particular Confederate commerce raider, that being the CSS Shenandoah, and kind of the long-term consequences, the long-term effects of Confederate commerce raiding on this one particular portion of the Northern Merchant Marine. With that being said, I always like to start a presentation about this with a story. And I'm going to start with a story that is at the end, really, chronologically of our story. But I think it's one of the more fascinating facets of this story. So I'm going to do exactly what you're not supposed to do and give away the ending, if you will, here at the beginning with this story. On the late afternoon of June 28th, 1865, Captain Thomas G. Young, the master of the whaleship Favorite, defiantly stood atop the roof of his cabin, brandishing revolvers and bomb guns. His courage, perhaps inspired by liquor, most likely inspired by liquor, was stout in the face of the nearing Confederate ship. He determined his ship would not be like the other 31 New Bedford whale ships that had fallen prey to Confederate pirates since 1862. Fearful for their captain's life, his crew pleaded with him to stand down. Any fight he would make would be fruitless, they argued, and would probably end up with the captain dying. But Young was a desperate man, and he refused to surrender. He made his desperation known when he proclaimed to his crew, quote, "I have only 4 or 5 years to live anyway, and I might as well die now as any other time, especially as all I have is invested in my vessel. And if I lose that, I will go home penniless and die a pauper," end quote. His crew was not sympathetic, though, with his desire to die a heroic death. Before abandoning their captain, they removed all the percussion caps from the revolvers and the bomb guns that the captain was brandishing, effectively rendering those pieces useless. As a boarding party from the CSS Shenandoah neared, the feared Confederate commerce raider, which did more damage to New Bedford's whaling industry than any other single vessel in the history of whaling in New Bedford, prepared to board the Favorite. Captain Young, holding his guns in a menacing manner, told the Confederates to stand off. When the unfazed Confederate naval officer advised Young to surrender or the cannons of the Shenandoah would blow his ship away, Young replied, "Blow away, my buck, but may I be eternally blasted if I haul down that American flag for any cursed Confederate pirate that ever floated." With that, Young pulled the trigger of his revolver. There was a problem, though. Click. No percussion caps, so the gun did not fire. The Confederate sailors moved in and quickly captured Young. But Young becomes a sort of folk hero in New Bedford. He's proclaimed in the local newspapers as the man who defiantly defied Waddell the pirate. And he really kind of gains a mythic status. The problem with this story, in many ways, is that it tells the story of these New Bedford whaling merchants who suffered dearly at the hand of Confederate commerce raiders and are never quite able to recover from the damage that is inflicted by these particular vessels in the course of the Civil War. When we look at the story a little bit closer, it becomes evident that that is not the case. Captain Young did not die a pauper. He actually died quite well off, eventually owning textile mills as a shareholder in textile mills in New Bedford. So what is really happening here? Did Confederate commerce raiders truly cripple New Bedford's whaling industry? Or rather, did they provide another opportunity for those who had invested in the whaling industry? And so that's what we're going to take a closer look at this evening. New Bedford becomes synonymous with whaling eventually, right? But it does not start out that way. Whaling will move to the small village of Bedford at that time, right around the 1790s. So shortly thereafter, the ending of the American Revolutionary War, Nantucket, really, still to this day, also synonymous with whaling, is the premier whaling port in colonial America. But the problem with New Bedford is that it's an island. It's not easy to get those products to other locations. Nantucket also has a sandbar, which makes it almost impossible for a heavy laden whale ship to get into the port. So there's a lot of factors that lead to Nantucket maybe not being the best location for the whaling industry by the latter half of the 18th. And so slowly but surely, more and more whaling merchants will move their operations to eventually what will become New Bedford, and New Bedford will grow from there. At its peak in the whaling days by the 1850s, New Bedford is home to over 300 whaling vessels, a massive fleet, and millions of dollars annually coming into the port. This made New Bedford one of the richest cities, arguably, in the whole country. But by the 1850s, there's also a very real problem for New Bedford whalers. More and more ships going out to sea, bringing in more and more product. You combine that with an economic depression in the late 1850s. And what you have is a glut in the market. Good old fashioned, economics 101, supply and demand. There are so many whale ships bringing in so much product that the supply becomes so much that and the demand lessens to a certain extent with the discovery of petroleum in Pennsylvania, and other things which start to lead people away from whale oil. So between a glut in the market and a lower demand, what happens to prices? They start to decline. And this is happening right on the eve of the American Civil War. What's also happening at this point is that New Bedford's whaling industry is aging out. Many of these whaling ships by the 1850s are 30 or 40 years old. These are wooden ships. They have a certain lifespan before they start to get old and decrepit and either need to be repaired or scuttled. So we see all of these factors combining where the industry looks like it's doing really good in 1857, reaching its climax, its most productive years. But the problem fundamentally is that things are starting to change. And whaling is slowly but surely becoming less and less lucrative for those that are involved in it. Of course, I would be remiss if I did not mention the effects of the whaling industry and certain individuals who lived in New Bedford and called New Bedford home, especially the Friends or the Quakers, and their anti-slavery beliefs. Certainly a key part of our story, Frederick Douglass taking on that new surname of Douglass right in the house that is still there on 7th Street, the Nathan and Polly Johnson house pictured on the lower left of your screen. Abolition and anti-slavery sentiment also an important part of our story. So it should not surprise us that when the Civil War breaks out, people in New Bedford are looking for ways to support the war effort, this war to preserve the Union, and eventually this war to end the institution of slavery. As I mentioned, a lot of these whaling vessels are getting older. They're starting to age out. The United States government, very early on in the war, is going to declare a naval blockade. And with that naval blockade, that's a great thing to say, right? If you are President Abraham Lincoln, that, oh, we are going to blockade southern ports. Well, that's great. But the United States Navy at the outset of the war only numbers around 40 to 50 naval vessels. You have thousands, tens of thousands of miles of coastline to effectively blockade with only a handful of ships. The numbers just don't add up. And certainly the US Navy will increase in size over the years through the war years. But people in the Naval Department are trying to figure out creative ways to make the blockade more effective. So there's the picture of Frederick Douglass in the Nathan and Polly Johnson house that I was alluding to, and the Stone Fleet. So this idea of purchasing these old merchant vessels for the purpose of sinking them in the harbors of the American South. And New Bedford whaling merchants, when prices like $2,500 to $5,000 for an old ship is being offered, it's a no-brainer for many of these individuals who are merchants in New Bedford. And they will start to sell off their old whaling vessels. All in all, 26 old New Bedford whaling vessels are sold as part of the Stone Fleet. And most of them are sailed down south to Charleston, South Carolina, where they are sunk in the main shipping channel there. All in all, the Stone Fleet is ineffective. Surveyors go the next year to see what the effect has been, and basically the tides are so powerful in Charleston Harbor that they have opened up new shipping channels, and what remains of those ships are not really effective blockading mechanisms any longer. But what this does do for New Bedford merchants is it provides them an income. An old ship that, in essence, in another 10 years, really would have been totally ineffective for a whaling voyage. These New Bedford merchants are much smarter than me, though, when they sell their whaling ships, these old whaling ships. in the early years of the war. So by January of 1862, a total of 26 New Bedford whaling vessels have been sold as part of the Stone Fleet. Now, enter into this story the idea of letters of marque. One thing that upset the Confederate government quite a bit was when the United States government declares a blockade of southern ports. They did not find this as a just thing to do. And President Jefferson Davis is going to fire back at President Abraham Lincoln with the issuance of letters of marque. Letters of marque and reprisal are basically a government-sponsored piracy. We are going to, in effect, the Confederate government is going to give private individuals who own ships these letters of marque and reprisal, which make them a functionary of the Confederate government. These are not Confederate naval vessels. They are private vessels held in private hands. So it's quite easy to see how eventually, right, this is how the pirates of great lore of the 17th and 18th century are born out of, right? European governments issuing letters of marque and reprisal. And then once you start to do stuff like that, the lines between piracy and government-sponsored piracy get awfully blurry fast. And so that is, in effect, what is going to happen when Jefferson Davis issues these letters of marque and reprisal. And New Bedford merchants do not like this. As we can see from the quote here on the screen, they are very upset with this idea of letters of marque and reprisal being awarded to private citizens of the South who own vessels. Quote, "The letters of marque and reprisal is a war upon private property and stands in marked disgraceful contrast with that of the President's proclamation, in which he declares the rights of private property shall be respected. The next step of the Confederates in rebellion will be to confiscate all debts from Southern men to Northern creditors," end quote. So this article appearing in April of 1861 in the Whalemen's Shipping List, which in effect was the Wall Street Journal, if you will, of the whaling industry. They kept track of all the business that was happening, the ships going in and out, and they also provided stories and editorial comments. And so that's what we see here is one of those editorial comments. New Bedford whalers are not happy with this. But even though they're not happy with it, the government-sponsored pirates do not prove effective really at all in doing what the Confederate president intended them to do. All in all, Confederate privateers capture only 3 whale ships in the course of the war. All 3 of them were from Provincetown, Massachusetts. So these letters of marque and reprisal, this government-sponsored piracy, has very little to no effect on New Bedford and the whaling industry. However, what is going to come about as an outgrowth of this is something fundamentally different, an idea that is the next step up, perhaps, from letters of marque and reprisal, but actual commissioned naval vessels of the Confederate Navy with commissioned officers and commissioned crew. This commissioned crew and these commissioned officers are going to man Confederate naval vessels. And these naval vessels are not going to be sent out to sea with the intent of fighting U.S. naval vessels. They're going to be sent out to sea with the intent of attacking deliberately the merchant marine. Was born the concept of the Confederate commerce raiders. And perhaps the most famous of these Confederate commerce raiders is none other than Raphael Semmes and his vessel, the CSS Alabama. The CSS Alabama is launched from Birkenhead Iron Works in Liverpool, England on July 29th, 1862. And as he's leaving the shipbuilding location, Birkenhead Iron Works in Liverpool in August of 1862, Semmes is going to look for his first victims, if you will, his first prey in the U.S. merchant marine. And he's going to settle on the seas in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Hawaii. And the reason why he is going to go there is because, as Semmes states in his memoirs, quote, "I resolved to strike a blow at the enemy's whale fishery off of the Azores," end quote. Semmes knows that at this time of year, as he's leaving England in August and September of 1862, that the Gulf Stream carries large amounts of plankton and krill, other forms of very small marine life that is the favorite feeding the favorite food source of the North Atlantic right whale. And so every year in August, September, October, because of the way that the Gulf Stream carries all of this food to that area, right whales congregate there and have a feeding frenzy of sorts. Well, this fact is not lost on those who hunt those whales. This is not lost on whalers. And so at that time of year, in late August into September and October, whale ships would congregate there off the coast of the Azores. Semmes knows this because prior to joining the Confederate Navy, Raphael Semmes worked for the U.S. Navy. And one of the particular roles that he held in the U.S. Navy prior to the war was the lighthouse superintendent. Lighthouses at that time are predominantly lit with whale oil. So Semmes has connections. He is a Southerner through and through. He has all these connections, though, from his involvement with the U.S. Navy as lighthouse superintendent. And he gains a familiarity with how the whaling industry works. And he knows that when he is leaving England in August of 1862, whalers are going to be congregating off the coast of the Azores. So that's where he's going to go. Unlike most merchant mariners, right? The oceans are big. The Atlantic Ocean is huge. The Pacific Ocean, even larger. To try to find a merchant vessel that is transporting goods from port to port, maybe in a small convoy, but usually not. A solitary ship in the middle of the ocean is like trying to find a needle in a haystack. If you have been tasked, like Semmes, with the destruction of U.S. merchant marine operations, Semmes realizes what better target than whalers, because whalers are going to be in certain parts of the globe at certain times of the year due to the nature of the fishing that they are doing, due to the nature of the hunting of the whales. Whalers are always going to be where whales are, and whales are relatively predictable creatures. At certain times of year, they are relatively predictable as to where they will be located. Semmes says as much in his memoirs. Semmes said this, quote, "Unlike the ships of commerce, the whalers are obliged to congregate within small, well-known spaces of ocean and remain there for weeks at a time, whilst the whaling season lasts. It was the most obvious thing in the world that these vessels, thus clustered together, should attract the attention of the Confederate cruisers." End quote. All in all, Semmes will have a very effective first few days hunting, if you will, whale ships off the coast of the Azores. In only 5 days, Semmes successfully captures 4 New Bedford whale ships, costing 4 separate merchants a total of approximately $71,000. So a relatively large blow within just the first 5 days of his activity. By the end of Semmes's Alabama voyage, Semmes and his crew on the Alabama had captured a total of 16 whaling vessels, with exactly half of those whaling vessels, 8 of them, being from New Bedford. These Confederates destroyed approximately $218,000 worth of product and supplies and vessels from New Bedford whalers, which equates to roughly $3 million in modern money. So a relatively large blow to the whaling industry that Semmes can effectively issue because he knows the nature of whaling. But really, Semmes's story is more important for our story here in the sense that it inspires the Confederate government to commission a Confederate commerce raider that almost has the sole expressed mission with attacking the whaling industry. Why? Because again, as Semmes points out, they are the most sensible, the easiest ones to attack and to inflict damage upon. And so the gentleman pictured here on the left, James Bullock, Confederate operative working in England, is going to work to purchase a vessel known as the Sea King, which will be purchased, refit, and rechristened as the CSS Shenandoah. For the Shenandoah, Lieutenant James I. Waddell will be chosen as the captain of the vessel. On October 5th, 1864, Bullock sends orders to Waddell, which reads, quote, "Sir, you are about to proceed upon a cruise in the far distant Pacific, into the seas and among the islands frequented by the great American whaling fleet, a source of abundant wealth to our enemies and a nursery for their seamen. It is hoped that you may be able to greatly damage and disperse that fleet, even if you do not succeed with utterly destroying it, end quote. So Waddell is being given distinct, clear orders that his mission is to make his way into the Pacific Ocean and there to focus in on the whaling industry of the North and to destroy as much of that U.S. whaling fleet as he possibly can. With largely an English crew, Waddell and his Confederate officers, all commissioned in the Confederate Navy, are going to start to set sail for the Pacific. By December 4th of 1864, they have arrived in the South Atlantic. So a few months' journey south. By December 4th, they are active in the South Atlantic. They have not arrived at their destination of the Pacific Ocean yet, but they're active in the South Atlantic. It's there that they are going to come across the vessel Edward, the whaling ship Edward, whose captain's name is Charles P. Worth. The crew of the Shenandoah and the crew of the Edward both describe a thick fog that hung over the water that day, making it almost imperceptible for either side to see the vessels. The Shenandoah is not looking for the Edward. They just kind of stumble upon them in happenstance in the middle of this thick fog storm. Here is a map that charts out the voyage of the Shenandoah. You'll see that thicker black line near the center of the map. They are making their way down through the Atlantic. They will go around Africa up into the Indian Ocean and eventually over into the Pacific Ocean. That was the safer journey to make at that time of year rather than trying to go around South America. So they're going to decide to head eastward after heading south. And it's there in the South Atlantic they stumble upon Captain Worth's crew cutting into a whale. The cutting in process, the picture depicted here, is basically the processing of the whales. I won't get into too much detail here, and I must confess it's been a long time since I've talked about these type of processes of how whales were processed. But once the whale was killed, the whale would be brought back to the whale ship. And that whale ship would come alive, almost like a mini industrial mill, if you will. Certain individuals would begin the process of actually starting to cut into the blubber of the whale and peeling it back, as you see happening here, the skin of the whale being peeled back. And then that blubber would be rendered down into oil right on the ship itself in a large kiln, basically called a tryworks. So they have this massive fireplace, if you will, set up on the ship's deck. That's where they're going to begin this process of rendering that blubber down through heating it up into oil, and then that oil will be stowed away in barrels below deck. So that's the process that's happening here, and that's exactly what Worth's crew is doing as the Shenandoah sneaks up. So not only is there this thick fog, but the crew of the Edward is so busy doing this process of cutting into the whale that they are completely oblivious that this Confederate commerce raider is sneaking up on them. Waddell is going to dispatch a boarding crew in longboats. And before the busily working men on the Edward realized what was happening, it was too late. Captain Worth was forced to surrender his vessel to the Shenandoah. The crew of the Shenandoah spent the next 2 days stripping the ship of all valuable materials. Fortunately for the Confederates, the Edward had just left New Bedford several weeks before, and so their ship was fully supplied, fully stocked. And this whale that they were actually in the process of processing was the first whale that they had actually captured, that they had killed on this voyage. So the bonus for Waddell and his crew is they get all of these fresh munitions and foodstuffs that is on this newly stocked whale ship. Waddell strips the vessel of all valuables, and then he's going to set the vessel on fire, burning and destroying all of the property, all the rest of the property that they did not deem of value on board, completely destroying the ship. Waddell is then going to take the crew to a local island where he's going to dump them off. He's basically going to parole these whale men on an island that is frequented by U.S. naval vessels and other U.S. merchant mariner ships, with the understanding that someone eventually will pick them up. And that's exactly what happens. The USS Iroquois, about a week and a half later, will pick up the crew members. Nobody is harmed in the process of this, but this is going to be the basic process that Waddell is going to undergo each time he captures a whale ship. They're going to loot the ship for anything of value, foodstuffs, anything that they can use or reuse. The rest of it, including oftentimes the whale oil itself, if it was a fully stocked ship, whale oil makes for perfect kindling of a wooden whale ship, if you will. So they will set these ships ablaze, completely destroying the ships. Their goal here is not to necessarily profit off of the capture of these merchant vessels, of these whaling vessels, like a pirate would be. Their goal is to destroy property because they see the destruction of the property as a more valuable war end for the Confederate cause. So they're going to completely destroy these vessels, and they are going to parole and dump these crews off in different places along the way. Ultimately, all in all, this prize of the Edward, this whale ship from New Bedford, was about $20,000 worth of value. So it's a decent first catch, if you will, for Waddell and his crew. In a letter written by Captain Worth, dated January 10th, 1865, he indicated the psychological effects of this capture. In exasperation, Worth wrote, quote, "We were robbed of everything we possessed, but our clothing and part of that was stolen on board the Shenandoah. We were broiling our first whale when captured, which would have made about 100 barrels of oil. My officers, crew, and myself are dependent on the U.S. consul at this place." They were in Cape Town at that point. "Not one of us has a single dollar left," end quote. The Shenandoah would continue on, capturing a few other merchant mariners along the way and causing some destruction. Ultimately, they will arrive in Melbourne, Australia, where they will refit. And it's off the coast of Australia that they are going to make a critical capture. They find in the Ascension Island area what would be modern day Micronesia. The Shenandoah, after refitting in Melbourne, arrives in the area of Micronesia, and they come across there several whaling vessels. Specifically, 4 vessels that laid an anchor, and all of them were American whalers. One of them, the ship Hector, was from New Bedford. The other 3 were from other northern ports. The Shenandoah is able to capture and destroy under the same circumstances. They capture these whaling vessels, all 4 of them. They're able to take things of value, and then they destroy all 4 of these whaling vessels, leave the crew off on a local island to be picked up later at some point. But the key here is what they captured off of one of those whale ships, and that was charts. There were the newly written out and drawn out charts of the whaling grounds in the northern Pacific. That ultimately is where Waddell was heading. We are now moving into the spring of 1865 when these captures are made. And the whaling fleet at this time would move up into the northern reaches of the Pacific Ocean and into the Arctic Ocean even to hunt whales in that area in the summer months. Once the ice starts to melt away and access is opened up, whalers really started to push into the northern reaches of the Pacific and the Arctic Oceans, because whales in that area are what? They're made to survive in colder weather. What makes them able to survive in colder water? More blubber. More blubber means more product per whale. So they're going to start to move into these reaches, and on one of these whale ships is the charts of the North Pacific whaling grounds. If you want to try to capture whaling vessels, their charts is an invaluable tool that can be used to help identify not just where he may think these whaling vessels are located, but where they actually are going to be. So it's an incredibly valuable find. Waddell jubilantly recalled in his memoirs this capture of these logs. He wrote, quote, "With such charts in my possession, I not only held a key to the navigation of all the Pacific Island, the Oshkosh and Bering Seas, and the Arctic Ocean, but the most probable localities for finding the great Arctic whaling fleet of New England without a tiresome search," end quote. Waddell knew what he had on his hands, and he's going to use these tools to its utmost advantage. By May of 1865, Waddell has arrived in the northern reaches of the Pacific Ocean after capturing a few more whaling vessels. I'll spare you all the details, but a few more whaling vessels and other merchant mariners captured along the way. By May of 1865, they are arriving in the northern reaches of the Pacific and traveling into the Bering Sea. Notice that date, May of 1865. I'm sure everyone in this room realizes this is well after a month after this scene that is behind me. Here is my background. The signing of the truce at Appomattox between Robert E. Lee and Grant. The surrender of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia has already happened. The surrender of Joe Johnson's army in the Carolinas has already happened. There's really only one or two still effective Confederate forces fighting in the field in May of 1865, and the Shenandoah is one of them. President Lincoln has been assassinated by May of 1865. So the stories that I'm about to tell you, the most destructive days of the Shenandoah, are happening arguably after most of the conflict has already come to an end. They're in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. News does not travel that fast in the 1860s, especially not when you're on a vessel. Waddell, in May of 1865, is going to come across some circumstantial evidence, or what he will claim is circumstantial evidence, that the war may be over, and he's going to ignore that evidence, and he's going to continue on well into June of 1865. But keep that in mind, that most of this is happening after the war has arguably come to a close. Waddell, in early May of 1865, is going to spot two more Yankee whaling vessels in the distance. Waddell is going to do what he customarily would do. He lowers the Confederate naval flag, and he's going to raise a Russian flag. He's very close to Russia, so he's going to use deception in order to get close to these whaling vessels. So he raises up a Russian flag, which allows him to move in close to these naval vessels, and then he's going to strike those colors, raise up the Confederate colors, and fire a warning shot. And effectively what this does is it forces these whaling vessels, they have no choice, right? There's no way, there's no hope of escape. They've kind of been lured into this trap, and they're forced to surrender. One of these vessels is the vessel by the name of Abigail of New Bedford. Waddell sends a boarding party out to the Abigail, and the captain of the vessel is a man by the name of Ebenezer Nye. And Captain Ebenezer Nye is astonished by what he sees. After expressing his disbelief at this whole situation, right, Nye basically says to these Confederate commerce raiders, I never expected that there would be a Confederate commerce raider here in the Bering Sea, as depicted here, right off the coast of Russia, right? This is the last place that they expected to see these Confederate commerce raiders, which probably is why Waddell is able to achieve so much success, right? Not only is he able to use certain degrees of trickery, but he's also attacking the whaling fleet where they feel safe on the complete opposite end of the globe of where most of the war is being fought. So Nye is completely astonished by this. He basically asks the young lieutenant, who is the boarding officer, what the hell are Confederate commerce raiders doing here? And the lieutenant slyly remarks, quote, we have entered into a treaty offensive and defensive with the whales, and we are up here by special agreement to dispose of their mortal enemy. So kind of a sly remark, a compact with the whale. The name of this presentation comes from this lieutenant who says that they have entered into a treaty offensive and defensive with the whales, a compact with the whales. Obviously, a joke. Nye did not see the humor in this joke, though. This was not Nye's first encounter with a Confederate cruiser either. Several years before, Captain Nye had captained another New Bedford whaling vessel, which had been captured by Semmes in the Alabama. So this poor captain, Ebenezer Nye, not only gets captured by one Confederate commerce raider, he gets captured by two Confederate commerce raiders throughout the course of the war, on two separate occasions, years apart. One of the crew members reportedly exclaimed at his captain, quote, you are more fortunate in picking up Confederate cruisers than whales. I will never again go with you, for if there is a cruiser out, you will find her. End quote. Luckily for Captain Nye, the war was coming to an end, so he did not have to worry about picking up any more Confederate cruisers. But Captain Nye, unfortunately, holds the distinction of being the only New Bedford whaling merchant, the only New Bedford whaling captain to have been captured on two separate different occasions by Confederate commerce raiders. But even more key than this kind of funny little story about Captain Nye and his capture is an individual who was working on the Abigail of New Bedford. One of the crew members, one of these whalers, is a man by the name of Thomas S. Manning. Manning was originally from Baltimore, Maryland. And so he grows up in the South. His family was slave owners. Eventually, Manning is going to make his way up to New Bedford, where he enlists on several whaling voyages, this just being one of those whaling voyages that he's going on. But the important point here is that Manning has Southern sympathies. So when the Shenandoah captures the vessel, Manning surrenders himself and offers his services to Waddell. This is a whaler who not only can look at those charts and maps, which Waddell has already captured, but he has firsthand, intimate knowledge of where ships actually are that particular year. He knows where the other whaling vessels are. So this is going to be even more of an important tool in the toolbox of Captain Waddell on the Shenandoah. And ultimately, this is going to culminate with two very successful days in June 21st and 22nd. The Shenandoah will capture 4 New Bedford whaling vessels and bond 1, causing an estimated $261,000 in damage just over those 2 days. From these whaling vessels, they are going to receive reports. These whaling vessels had recently left from San Francisco, that President Lincoln may have been assassinated, that the war may be over. Waddell is going to choose to ignore these supposed reports of assassination and the end of war, and will continue on his voyage. Several days later, on June 26th, the Shenandoah catches 3 more prizes, but only one of them was a whaler from New Bedford. The Nimrod from New Bedford was this unfortunate whaler. June 27th will prove to be really the most damaging of all the days to New Bedford's whaling industry that the Shenandoah is able to inflict. On June 27th, early in the morning, Waddell is going to spot 11 more whale ships in the distance. First, the Shenandoah is able to easily capture the whaler Waverly from New Bedford and burn and destroy it. And a little bit before noon, the Shenandoah was approaching the other 10 vessels. What had happened was one of these 10 vessels had sprung a leak. And it was a slow leak, but the vessel was not repairable. And so the other vessels had gathered around to divvy up the supplies and the crew that was on that vessel. Basically, they're having an auction at sea, if you will, to determine where all the supplies and all the whale oil and where these whalers are going to wind up and how they're going to get them back home, because their ship is basically ineffective. So he stumbles upon this auction, if you will, where all of these vessels are closely gathered around each other. They're all defenseless. Waddell sneaks up on these 10 vessels, and he is able to secure the surrender of 9 out of those 10 vessels. Of those 9 vessels, 6 were from New Bedford: the James Murray, the Isaac Hallen, the Nassau, the Congress, the Hillman, and the Martha. But there was one ship that refused to surrender. How we started this presentation with the story of Captain Young and the Favorite of New Bedford. Captain Young and his story of defiance. Ultimately, though, we know, as I've already indicated, Captain Young even is forced to surrender. The Shenandoah will burn approximately $340,000 worth of vessels and captured whale materials. They will also bond one of the vessels for $37,000, placing all of the captured whalers on that one vessel and sending them back to San Francisco, with the understanding that the owners of that vessel are to pay the Confederate government $37,000 for the value of that vessel. Obviously, that's never going to happen. The war is over, but the principle was basically a paroling of the vessel. He needs to get rid of all these whalers that they have captured, now numbering in the hundreds. They're going to put them all on one whale vessel and send them back to San Francisco to there be paroled and bonded. The total price tag for the city of New Bedford for this one single day was over $370,000 of materials destroyed, ships destroyed, and whale product destroyed. It is after this day, though, on June 27th, Waddell, one of the ships actually has newspapers on it from San Francisco, indicating these things that he had heard tangentially about the assassination of President Lincoln, the ending of the war. Waddell decides that it's best to probably stop doing this at this point because it does seem like the war is in fact over, and he's going to start to make his way back to England. And ultimately, he will not surrender his vessel until November of 1865, the last effective Confederate force in the field, or in the ocean, if you will, in the field, if you will, to surrender. And they're not going to surrender to U.S. authorities for the fear that they will be prosecuted as pirates. And they probably were right. Waddell is going to surrender to the English government, to the government of Great Britain in November of 1865, and ultimately is able to stay what most likely would have been his fate of execution for his acts during the war. The Shenandoah destroyed, in the end, in total, the Shenandoah captured 38 ships, destroyed 34 of them, and bonded 4. Of these 38, 25 were whale ships. And of this number, 21 were from New Bedford. All in all, 21 New Bedford whale ships are destroyed at the hands of the Shenandoah. This destruction equated to well over $1.1 million worth of value, a huge, huge strike at the whaling industry and the whaling economy. Exactly what the Confederate government intended to do, exactly what the Confederate Navy intended to do, to strike a serious blow at New Bedford's whaling industry, at the whaling industry of the Northeast. And I would say that they were pretty darn effective at that. Now, we could stop the story there. We could say that that's the end of the story, that the Civil War was awful for New Bedford whaling merchants, and that they never reaped any benefit from it. But the facts of the matter is that is not at all true. Yes, all of this product, these vessels were destroyed, but every vessel that went to sea had insurance on it. Here on the screen, this image is from some of those insurance records, courtesy of the New Bedford Whaling Museum. They have extensive collections of insurance records, insurance logs, and it was through a lot of this work, through a lot of this information, and going through a lot of these that it becomes very clear that New Bedford's whaling merchants made out quite well from the destruction of their ships throughout the course of the war. The owners of these vessels, oftentimes merely shareholders, right? Not one individual owning a ship, but multiple individuals pooling their money together, being shareholders in these vessels, would take out insurance not only for the vessel, but sometimes for materials on the vessel as well. So, for example, if you were a 5% owner of a whale ship, it's not uncommon for individuals to take out an insurance claim on 5% of the vessel that they owned. So they're not paying for the insurance of the whole vessel, but they're paying for the very specific portion of the vessel that they owned. There were numerous agents and companies in New Bedford who were selling this. And in fact, if information could be had of how much product was on a whaling vessel. Well, for example, let's say a whale ship goes off into the Pacific Ocean. Whaling voyages at this time could last anywhere from 2 to 5 years, right? These are multi-year voyages that these whaling ships are going on, alternating seasons between the North Pacific, the Central Pacific, and the South Pacific. If they could get information, let's say into San Francisco, where information about how much how much whale oil they had on the ship could be telegraphed back to New Bedford. It's not uncommon for the owners of that whale ship to then go out and take insurance out on the catchings on the ship. And this is always denoted in these insurance records as catching, insurance on catching. And you can actually, maybe you can, maybe you can't see it, but when you look at the lines here towards the middle of the page where you see the crease going down, the third entry down from the red lines that you see, there's two series of 2 red lines. The bottom red line, the third entry down, is for catchings on the Swift, on a certain vessel that is located, the catchings on the Swift. So they are literally taking out insurance on the whale oil that has already been caught up to that point. And what we see when these vessels are destroyed, these insurance companies are the ones that I know this is surprising for us today because insurance companies never lose today, it seems like. But the insurance companies are forced to pay these insurance claims on both the vessels themselves and the catching. And when we look at the records of which ships and cross-reference the records of the ships that were destroyed by the Shenandoah and these insurance claims, nearly every single owner or part owner in a ship got some sort of insurance payout that equated to their investment in that vessel. So they are not losing money in this enterprise. They are getting insurance payments. And these insurance payments have done what? I mentioned at the beginning that the whaling fleet is starting to age out. A lot of these vessels that are getting captured by the Shenandoah and burned by the Shenandoah are upwards of 20 to 30 years old. So they're reaching the end of their life, their usable life anyways. So many of these whaling merchants are being freed of this investment of a whale ship with the payment of these insurance claims. And now they have this free capital to do with what they want. And as we look at what's happening in New Bedford at that time, in 1854, the first industrial textile mill is built in New Bedford, the Wamsutta Mills. We see a large growth in steam-powered textile mills in New Bedford in the 1860s. And who are the people who are investing in many of these textile mills? Many of them are these same people who are listed as whaling merchants, as investors in these whaling vessels. And many of them are paying their interest, their shares in these new textile companies with insurance payments on the ships that are destroyed by the Shenandoah. So we could almost argue that the Shenandoah is freeing them of these older investments, of these investments in hard capital and in these ships that are aging out anyways, and are allowing them to invest in something new, something that is going to have a longer longevity than whaling. Whaling is going to start to die starting in the 1850s. It's a slow, decrepit decline of whaling over the latter half of the 19th century, but it is a clear decline. These insurance payments are helping many of those people to get out of an industry that is starting to decline. We don't stop there, though, because in the years after the war, there will be a U.S. commission that is going to be formed that is going to question the actions of the British government during the war. The Alabama was made in Liverpool. The Shenandoah was an English vessel purchased by Confederate operatives in England. It's an English vessel that is repurposed by the Confederate government. These are just two examples of the actions that are being taken by the English government, especially when it comes to Confederate naval operations and the building or purchasing of ships. Individuals in the United States in the post-war years are going to want to hold the English government accountable for those actions, because they would argue that the Confederates are only able to do this because the English government provides them with these vessels. What this is all going to culminate in is the U.S. commissioners indicating 5 categorical ways the British government should be held monetarily accountable for the effects of 5 specific Confederate commerce raiders throughout the course of the war. So these claims ultimately become known as the Alabama claims, arguably the most famous of the Confederate commerce raiders. But these claims are going to extend not only to the destruction that the Alabama causes, but also the CSS Sumter, which also did damage to the whaling industry, and especially for our story and our purposes tonight here, the damage that the CSS Shenandoah did. The claims are going to include, for quote, claims for private losses growing out of the destruction of vessels and their cargo, and the enhanced payments of insurance by private people. So the U.S. commissioners are looking to recoup money from the English government for 2 specific reasons, one of which being for the destruction of the vessels and the destruction of the product in the vessels. The other one being for increased insurance rates, which were paid by merchants at the time. There are war rates which are given, which are higher insurance rates that are being paid out by these individuals than normally would have been paid. So basically, the US commissioners are arguing that the English government should be held culpable, should be held accountable for both the destruction of the vessels and increased insurance rates paid by merchants. There is a meeting held in Geneva in 1872, and a tribunal is called, composed of Charles Francis Adams of the United States, as well as Attorney General Maxwell Evarts, Sir Alexander Cochrane of Great Britain, and 3 neutral members from Italy, Switzerland, and Brazil. This tribunal is going to award the United States government in money at that time $15.5 million. These payments were made in a series of payments from March of 1877 to June of 1886. And ultimately, the British government would pay the US government $16,292,000. The additional $790,000 from that original settlement was ordered to be paid by the tribunal from accumulated interest from the time of the war at 4% annual from the date of the destruction of private property. So at that point, nearly 10 years had passed since Appomattox by the time that the last payment in the Alabama claims is made. What the State Department is going to decide to do with this money is to commission individuals in major port cities in the Northeast. So in New Bedford, the State Department is going to commission the organization of Clifford, and Crapo to serve as their representatives. They're going to be deputized as commissioners of the Court of the Alabama Claims. And so individuals who live in the area of New Bedford who suffered some kind of loss at the hand of Confederate commerce raiders should submit a claim to Clifford, and Crapo, and then they would adjudicate with the State Department a decision about whether or not money would be issued. What we see here on this slide is one example of a claim filled out. So this example was filled out by a Hannah P. Payne. Hannah Payne was of a prominent family in New Bedford. Her husband was a merchant mariner, one of the merchant whalers in New Bedford, and she actually herself owned a portion of a vessel as well. And so she's going to file her own claim before the court for hopefully reimbursement of the money that would be lost for the destruction of the vessel Nassau. So we see here towards the top, Hannah P. Payne, claimant in the matter of the ship Nassau destroyed by the insurgent cruiser Shenandoah. And so what we see over the series of this claim, several pages, is Hannah Payne listing out all of her investments in that vessel. What did it equate to? And so she lists out her shareholding in this vessel as follows. For the loss of the ship, 4/32 of the ship Nassau. So she owned 4/32 of this whaling vessel. For that, she equated the total to be $3,750. For the loss of 4/32 of her outfits, of the Nassau's outfits, $6,250. For the loss of 4/32 of 100 barrels of whale oil at $1.31 per gallon, $4,000. For loss of 4/32 of 2,400 pounds of whalebone at $1.63 per pound, $3,993. For the loss of 4/32 of 1,500 pounds of ivory at 80 cents per pound, $1,200. So she is literally going through and listing exactly what was on the ship, not only the value of the ship itself, the value of the ship's outfits, all the materials, all the other stuff on the ship, but she's also listing out the value of the product that was on the ship at that time. And this is going to come to a grand total of $11,165. This is just one example of an Alabama claim record here. We know that Hannah Payne is going to get paid that $11,000 out of that settlement by the State Department. We also see former sea captains, not only owners, but sea captains who will file claims as well. We also see things like this, and I find this fascinating, right? This is in the Clifford and Crapo records. It's a handwritten note by a man by the name of John Hallett, where he is going through counting for things that he lost when the vessel was captured by the Shenandoah. And so we see everything here from a Bible listed to a dictionary to a nautical almanac to a pocket watch to 3 oak carved chairs. So this captain is literally listing out not only the value of things on the ship, but value of his personal possessions, which are taken away from him. We know that John Hallett gets his full request, gets paid for everything that is listed here in this image by the court. We also see individuals, people including individual whalers who are going to write similar reports to Clifford and Crapo to be paid out. In all, Clifford and Crapo work with community members filing claims on 40 separate whaling vessels and paying out a total of $301,000. Now, keep in mind, right, this is $301,000 that's being paid out sometimes to individual whalers, sometimes to these merchants, sometimes to the captains of these vessels. Remember, though, those payments that are being made to the merchants, this is after they've already received insurance payouts too. So many of these merchants are almost double dipping, if you will, for the destruction that happens at the hands of these Confederate commerce raiders, where they are getting paid out by insurance companies for the amount of product that is destroyed and the vessel that's destroyed. And then with the Alabama claims, are doubling that value in the end with payments out from the Alabama claims. So the moral of the story is that the merchants are not losing out. Although this seems like a very destructive story, and it certainly is, the Shenandoah, the Sumter, the Alabama are all very effective at crushing portions of the whaling fleet. What it does do is it provides these New Bedford merchants with an opportunity, as one historian, early historian from the early 20th century described it, allowed for these merchants to make the transition from whalers to weavers, to move from the whaling industry into textile industry. The destructiveness of the Confederate commerce raiders had a few benefits for the whaling industry in New Bedford over the course of the war. The whaling fleet shrunk by nearly 40% over the course of the war years. Between old whale ships sold as part of the Stone Fleet, vessels destroyed by Confederate commerce raiders, and other vessels that never left the port during the war years, fewer and fewer whalers went out to sea. With fewer vessels whaling, New Bedford produced less oil. Following a time in the 1850s where the industry had grown larger than its market, the American Civil War provided a welcome reprieve from declining prices. In fact, prices rise dramatically over the war years because of a decrease in supply of product. For those who sent whale ships to sea and took on that risk, the potential for profit increased significantly during the war years. Increased profits led many to reinvest in whaling. Recovering from the Panic of 1857 and the overproduction of the late 1850s, many individuals like William Gifford renewed investments in the industry. And by the late 1860s, whaling rebounded. But by the 1870s, with increased competition resulting from the refinement of oil, crude oil, and markets once again in flux, made the market unfavorable. Arctic disasters compounded these negative factors, and slowly but surely the whaling industry continued to decline. However, for some individuals like Matthew Howland, availability of capital during the American Civil War offered a new opportunity. Steam-powered industrial mills gained popularity by the mid-19th century. No longer tied to water power, places like New Bedford, which had limited energy-producing water sources, could build their own mills. Having ready access to coal via shipping routes, the number of steam-powered mills in New Bedford increased exponentially during the latter half of the 19th century. By the dawn of the 20th century, New Bedford was one of the leaders in steam-powered mills in the nation. This story is an example of how something so destructive as war can force a paradigm shift within a community that can make those places arguably economically more resilient and sustainable.